Hey everyone, my name is Moroz,
Good afternoon. My name is Wylie Veasey.
and today we're going to speak about the effects of drugs and the drug war on African Americans. The drug war in the United States has affected the country as a whole, with a disproportionate effect on African Americans. Of the 2.2 million Americans in prison or in jail, about 50% of them were incarcerated for a drug-related offense. Of those incarcerated for drug offenses in the United States, 32% were African Americans in 2010. However, African Americans only represent 12% of monthly drug users, according to the NAACP's current criminal justice fact sheet. These are very troubling figures for the African American community. Through our extensive research, we have found out how much the United States has spent on the war on drugs, and who is being hurt the most as a result of the war on drugs. In addition to viewing the United States as a whole, we were able to focus our research on the Philadelphia region. This region of our country has been greatly hurt by drug-related violence. During our presentation, we would like to show you the effectiveness, or lack thereof, of criminalizing recreational drug use, and the disproportionate effects of the aforementioned on African Americans. In addition, we would like you to reflect on the effects of the drug war on Philadelphia itself in terms of race and social status.
In June 1971, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, coining the term. Ronald Reagan, after being elected in 1980, continued this war with his Just Say No campaign. Since then, we spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs, at a rate of $51 billion each year. What has been the result? What effect has the spending had on our country in general? And how are these effects distributed in terms of race? To be frank, it's been a complete failure. Even U.S. drug czar Gil Kurlikowski admits that it's so. In the grand scheme, it has not been successful, he said. 40 years later, the concern about drugs and drug problems is, if anything, magnified, intensified. Today, the war on drugs is anything but over. In fact, the misguided policies of the war on drugs continue to this day, as President Obama has conducted more raids of medical marijuana facilities in his tenure than had been conducted in the previous 12 years combined. Everyone of all races is harmed by these policies. However, African Americans and other minorities experience this harm at higher rates. One of the prime examples of this uneven distribution of harm is the criminal justice system. According to the NAACP, there are 5 times as many white people who are using drugs than African Americans. But the number of African Americans who are sent to jail for a drug-related crime is 10 times the number of white people who go to jail for similar offenses. On the surface, this fact can mean multiple things. It could mean that African Americans are receiving unequal treatment in the judicial system, or it could simply suggest that there are far too many African Americans who take part in illicit activities, such as those related to drugs, but that's simply not the case. In fact, in 2002, black people constituted more than 80% of the people sentenced under the federal crack cocaine laws and served substantially more time in prison for drug offenses than did whites, despite the fact that more than 2/3 of crack cocaine users in the U.S. are white or Hispanic. This shows that for whatever reason, African Americans are being disproportionately prosecuted for drug use. We're not saying that the criminal justice system is purposefully functioning in a racist way, but the result is undeniable.
The NAACP goes on to explain the factors that contribute to these figures. The most important factors are, quote, inner-city crime prompted by social and economic isolation and the war on drugs, end quote. Alternatively stated, African Americans are generally poorer due to poverty caused by lack of employment opportunities or qualifications, and as a result, resort to drug use and drug dealing as a source of income. This leads to a concentration of violence in these communities. Young African American men commit half of all murders in the United States, and do so at a rate 14 times that of young white men, according to a U.S. Department of Justice report which surveyed homicide statistics between 1974 and 2004. The concentration of violence in these communities leads to an analogous concentration of police, and in turn a larger incarceration rate for these communities. Since the majority of inhabitants in these communities are minorities, minorities are therefore incarcerated at a disproportionate rate. It interested us to see the whole discussion of African American drug use and incarceration leads back to the war on drugs. One of the epicenters of the war on drugs and drug use in general is the city we're in now, Philadelphia. Particularly, the intersection of Kensington and Somerset is a #1 drug corner in the city. With some of the highest poverty rates and drug use rates in the country, Kensington is a microcosm of almost everything that could have gone wrong with a neighborhood. It used to be a booming, working-class neighborhood sprawling with factories throughout the area. Now, these factories have closed, some going bankrupt and some moving to the south, where it's cheaper to do business. The buildings now sit there, dilapidated, symbols of what went wrong.
Kensington is 63% non-white as of the 2010 census. The average income is $38,235, and the poverty rate is 46.9%. It should come as no surprise that many residents of this neighborhood have to resort to a life of crime, particularly drug dealing, to survive. Those who don't deal may become one of the many living in the so-called abandonmeniums of Kensington, abandoned homes, taken over by drug users. As one neighborhood dealer explained in a National Geographic documentary on drugs in Philadelphia, he used to work at McDonald's, and then he saw his friends making a lot more money than him dealing drugs. To him, and to many others like him, there was no point in working legally. The decision they made affects the rest of their lives. Even if they don't get killed by rivals, they don't have the chance to become lawful members of society. You're effectively stuck in that lifestyle. As the same dealer explains, you can only leave the drug business in a casket. Many do just that, and that's why Philadelphia's murder rate in 2011 was 20.7 per 100,000, the highest rate among big U.S. cities. The closest to us was Chicago at 15.7. Almost all of the victims were African American or Hispanic. The drug war itself has a disproportionate impact on minorities, but so do drugs themselves. With the incarceration rates and homicide rates as they are, African Americans are getting the shorter end of more than one stick. There's no denying the multitude of problems associated with recreational drug use. Whether it's legal or not, however, we must realize that mass imprisonment and the perpetuation of violence will not solve these problems. Ultimately, we must decide, as a country, if the decriminalization of drugs and equal enforcement of whatever law we have is the right path for us to take. It certainly can't be much of a failure as our current policy.